Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all well and you can hear me okay. My name's Henry, and I am a business development manager here at NQA. We're here this morning for a 30 to 45-minute webinar on internal auditing in SMEs. I'm going to start off with a very quick overview of NQA, who we are and what we do. I'm not a very talented ventriloquist. I will be passing you over to Stephen, who you'll be able to see for the main part of the webinar. Stephen, next page, please. So who are NQA? As you can see, we're a global certification body. We are owned by a large American company called NTS, who are leaders in the testing and inspection industry. We have a large number of standards that we certify to, covering a range of management systems. We've been around for well over 30 years now. We have 1,000 employees globally, with over 50,000 certificates. Breaking that down to the UK, it's just over 100 employees with 12,000 active certificates. We have an average partnership of over 10 years, which, considering the certification cycle is 3 years, you can see there is a high retention of clients there. This is also backed up by our Net Promoter Score, which is a metric calculating the likelihood that a customer would recommend a company to a colleague or a friend. So the range is between -100 and +100, and NQA are sat currently at 70, which is the highest within our industry. Our core standards in the UK are 9001, which is quality management, 14001 environmental, and 45001, which is health and safety. However, given the recent pandemic, we have seen a large increase in information security, which is 27001. Obviously, more and more people working from home, so information security has become high in importance. Also, 22301, which is business continuity management, follows on nicely from the information security, and obviously, again, reflected of the pandemic over the past couple of years. So looking at the infographic, as you can see, in the US, we are the #1 certification body in the aerospace sector, with some extremely high-level clients there. We're also #1 in China in the automotive sector by a long stretch, and the global #1 certification body in the telecoms and automotive sector. Next slide, please, Stephen. So yeah, the certification services and training that we offer on the basic standards mentioned earlier, the 9, 14, 45,001. However, we also certify to 50,001, 27, 22,301, 13,485, which is medical devices, and IATF for automotive and aerospace standards. All of our training services are available both face-to-face or online. Obviously, we've had to make all of our training online recently due to the pandemic, but we're getting back to some form of normality. And we've seen a high number of successful remote training through our client base. Next slide, please, Stephen. So yeah, nationwide training services for all existing clients. We also offer completely free e-learning services. So however many employees you have in your organisation who you wish to upskill on any of the standards mentioned earlier, we offer that for free. And even if you're not an existing client, it's really not an expensive option. They're really good courses. Most of the NQA team have taken the courses as part of their induction. We offer in-house training as well. So let's say, for example, you have 5 to 6 employees in your organisation you feel would benefit from a training course, whether it be an implementation of a particular standard or to an internal auditor level or lead auditor level. We would arrange one of our trainers to visit you on site to deliver the requested training. Obviously, again, it's been conducted remotely recently, but we are getting back to being on site. And then we also have public training courses available. They're available through courses which we run in hotels across the UK. So any further information on the training courses that you'd like to look up are available on the NQA website. That's NQA. So next slide, please, Stephen. So that's NQA as a high-level overview. Thank you for listening. As promised, I'm now going to hand you over to Stephen to discuss internal audits. So over to you, Stephen.
Okay, thanks, Henry, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning for what will be some personal reflections based on 20 odd years of auditing small and medium and micro businesses, primarily to the principal 3 standards that Henry mentioned, so ISO 9001, 14,001 and 45,001. It occurred to me I should say at the outset that these are my own sort of thoughts and musings. They're not necessarily NQA's views and opinions. So please, don't get the impression that I'm in any way presenting NQA policy or views, and there may be some feedback on that at the end. I don't know. So you'll have seen the advanced information about the webinar, very much a personal reflection. And I thought I'd kick off, if I may, with a rather nice testimonial that I picked up from a client. This is going back some 10 years or so. She was good enough to provide this little paragraph talking about some of the suggestions and ideas that came out of our audit sessions that we had together. And I wanted to set that testimonial in the context of the ISO definitions of what an audit is. These are the standard definitions that many of you will already be familiar with, which would no doubt cover quite extensively if this were an audit training course, about what an audit is, gathering evidence and evaluating it against audit criteria, so requirements of the standard or requirements of a management system. And also that clause in all the management system standards that follow the high-level structure about having to carry out internal audits in order to determine conformity to requirements, whether they're in the standard or the management system, and the extent to which the management system is effectively implemented and maintained. So those effectively two legs of auditing, conformity to requirements and maintaining the management system. The point here is if I apply a little bit of selective highlighting to that rather lovely testimonial, just to pull out some of the key words that the client was using there. None of those words actually appear in the ISO definitions. In fact, the ideas that she's putting forward there aren't even part of the concept of auditing as they're framed in those ISO definitions. It's almost as though the client is appraising a different activity. And that leads me to think one of two things. Either I've been doing completely the wrong thing for these past 20 odd years, and somehow or other the certification bodies haven't yet noticed, or that part of the audit process that the client really values and chooses to focus on in that testimonial is actually something apart from that basic function of an audit as envisaged in the ISO definitions. It's something that actually transcends that essential conformity to requirements and maintaining the management system, something over and above that. And to think about that, I want to borrow a model from wider management thinking and strategy thinking from this gentleman, whom some of you will recognize, I'm sure. This is a chap called Simon Sinek, whose book Start With Why and corresponding TED Talk develops this idea of what he calls the golden circle that you can see on the flip chart behind him. And his basic thesis is that successful organizations are those which focus and promote and concentrate on and are seen to focus not so much on what they do, as in products and services, or even how they do what they do, but on some overriding mission or vision, their central raison d'etre for the organization, if you like, and that these are the organizations that are successful. And without dwelling too much on the overall management thinking, if I borrow that model and I apply it in the audit world, it seems to me that auditors historically and stereotypically have been very, very good at looking at what organizations do. And we've been very good at looking at how they are doing it, because we're used to focusing on things like documented procedures that spell out very precisely what needs to be done in what order, and the methods and the processes and the tools and the resources and the records that are generated from the procedures and all this kind of thing. less part of the traditional auditor's mindset is that question around why. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing it in this particular way as opposed to that particular way? Why is this document the most useful way of doing things? And a small sidestep, if we reframe that question ever so slightly and start thinking around, is this the best way of doing things? And actually, what would be the risk if we were to change this to do it a slightly different way? And once we start to introduce that question around what is the risk, we're actually getting back onto more familiar auditing territory, certainly in terms of the current management systems standards, which all talk about risk-based thinking, trying to identify risks and opportunities. But it's only a slightly different way of putting that same question, of trying to think about the rationale and the justification for why are we doing what we're doing in this particular way. And if we apply that to elements of the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle as it applies to auditing, we start off thinking about the way we plan our audit schedules, our audit programs, and we'll all have looked at some form of program, whether it's depending on the size of our organization, it's a monthly program or quarterly or perhaps an annual program. And we define our audit scopes, whether by location or job function or perhaps different areas of a production facility, or break them down by procedures. And we'll plan them out. This one's being done in January and that one in May and that one in September and so on. And there is a little bit of a temptation to, when we're planning the next one, simply pick up the last one and carry it forward and do the same thing again. But there is an explicit invitation in all the management systems standards to take into account, when we're planning our audits, the importance of the processes that we're auditing, and also the status, the results of previous audits and any other relevant factors, because not all of these will carry the same level of risk or the same level of necessity for an audit each time. It doesn't follow that we have to audit the same things each year. And there is actually an opportunity to deprioritize certain areas. Let me give you an example. There's an organization that I've been in and have been auditing for around 15 years, internal audits, but I go in as an outsourced internal auditor with a colleague, and we're auditing to ISO 9001 and 14001. For most of that 15 years, the customer services department has been the critical interface with their customers. So it's customer services, it's only a small department, 4 people, 5 people, but they will typically take in all the initial customer inquiries, they will take in customer orders, they convert them to production orders to go into the manufacturing facility. They also coordinate raw materials deliveries to ensure the flow of raw materials marries up with product demand. They oversee the dispatch and export of this product all over the world. And of course, they pick up any post-delivery customer communications, including complaints. So they are an absolutely key department. But here's the thing. The company really only makes one product. It's quite a niche product. They only sell it to about half a dozen major industrial customers throughout the world. And for all of that 15 years, those things have never really much changed. The processes haven't really changed. The way customer services operates haven't really changed. And actually, the people haven't changed. It's the same lady that heads up customer services now, as was there when I started auditing there 15 years ago. And there's literally nothing she doesn't know about the processes in customer services. And every time I have been into that department, bar none, she has been able to provide a perfect explanation and demonstration of any audit trail I have wanted to raise, and been able immediately to lay her hands on any piece of evidence I've wanted. So from an audit point of view, when I look at that department, the degree of risk in that area, unless something changes, is as close to zero as I'm comfortable with as an auditor. So it's just a waste of my time and hers going back in on a regular basis just to tick the box to say, yes, we've been back in again. What we actually did with this organization was there's quite a complex audit schedule, but we changed the schedule basis from being an annual program to being a 3-year audit program, reflecting the recertification cycle. And we said, customer services is a key department, but it's so well established and so stable. Check to make sure it's still being maintained. Unless something changes, we can focus on other areas of the business that are less stable, shall we say, less secure. So where there's no risk, let's not spend time there. You can do the same even if you've only got one internal audit every year. Many small organizations I go to will only have one internal audit and a management review and the third party visit. And those are the 3 key controls during the year. But even with a single internal audit in a year, you don't necessarily have to cover everything if the level of risk isn't there. I go into very small organizations, half a dozen people, and it's the same people that were there last year doing the same things they were doing last year. And if they've not had to do any further training, for example, or any upskilling or any refresher training, it's a complete waste of time delving into training records and trying to interrogate competency matrices and so on. A one-liner will do. Same as last year? Yeah, same as last year. One line in the audit report, move on to other areas where there are perhaps different risks or things have changed and there are different things organizations need to grapple with, and goodness knows there's been enough of those in the last couple of years. Of course, the flip side of that risk question is the whole idea of opportunities. If we're downplaying the risk areas, that opens up opportunities for us to look into other areas, places we may not have been before, or to do things in a different way, just to turn the audit program back to front, start at the end instead of the beginning, or start in a different department, or do the audit interviews in a different order or in a different way, go somewhere we've not been before. There was an organization that I went into last year. I've been auditing this organization again for a few years, and I spotted on the organization chart a team within the technical support engineers that I wasn't familiar with. It occurred to me I've not spoken to any of these guys before. Let's go there. Let's have a conversation with these people. Let's get their perspective. I'd spoken to many of the other engineers, but not this particular section. It turns out this is a relatively new team that was established about 2 years ago, and they're operating in a rather different way to the rest of the engineering team. And it's been so successful, it's becoming quite a significant part of the business and potentially will be a template for other similar teams to be set up. And we were able to have a really interesting discussion around how some of their processes integrated with the existing processes in the rest of the organization, and also how some of their performance criteria were monitored and how they integrated or didn't integrate with the rest of the company. So it was a really interesting conversation, but the point is we wouldn't have had that conversation if I hadn't made the deliberate decision to let's try and find somewhere I haven't been before. There's maybe an opportunity to add value in a different place to where I'd been if I'd simply adopted the same audit program as last year. So moving on from the planning stage into the actual doing bit of the audits, and for most of us, me included, when we think of auditing, when I think of auditing, the meat and potatoes is the audit interviews. It's sitting and talking to people. It's changed a little bit in the last couple of years, of course, but essentially the audit interview still for me is the main opportunity to look into interesting audit trails and areas of assessment. And I think there are some key things about operating as an internal auditor in a small organization that set us apart from a larger organization. I was just talking to Henry earlier on, just before we started, and he said, well, things are sometimes more difficult in a small organization. Actually, I take exactly the opposite view. I think things are a lot easier for a number of reasons. So one of those is there tends to be less formality in my experience. I do appreciate I'm generalizing here, but in my experience, there's less formality in a smaller team. And I don't just mean in terms of personal relationships. There tends to be more pliability in terms of roles, perhaps a little bit more crossover because people are covering each other's backs, which in turn gives you easier access into interlocking stages of different processes. But there also tend to be fewer bureaucratic silos. It's easier to cross over from one stage or one part of a process to another because you're probably only going across the room or across the corridor, whereas in a larger organization, it could be across the site or it could be to a different location entirely. And for me, that makes it easier to get an end-to-end view of the processes and understand how things should work. I think as internal auditors, as opposed to external, as opposed to third-party auditors, if we manage to achieve that relationship where we're effectively one of the team, we are working for and within the organization. So we should be able to develop a more intuitive understanding of where things live, who does what. Because sometimes people will do things that aren't necessarily a core part of their job role, but they take them on for historical reasons or because they've got particular skills. And we get to understand how people and processes fit together, what things should look like, where the documentation is expected to live, and what it's going to look like. So there's slightly less effort involved than there might be, say, for an external third-party auditor coming in only once every year or once every 6 months, looking at these processes. So we can more easily get to that base point, if you like, of is this compliant? Does it conform to the requirements? I suggest we can get there more easily. And what that does is open up that opportunity for us to get beyond that point and focus on, okay, we know it conforms. How effective is it? Is it working well? Is there space for improvement ideas here? And actually go beyond that essential ISO definition, if you like. And perhaps surprisingly, a lot of the ISO publications do support a more flexible approach to audits than we might think. People tend to have a view of ISO and ISO standards and ISO auditing as being a bit straight-laced, a bit nitpicking, a bit focused on the nuts and bolts and the dots and commas. But actually, a lot of the publications put out by ISO encourage flexibility, encourage a broader, more flexible approach. So as an example, there is a standard many of you will know, ISO 19011 Guidelines for Auditing Management Systems. And it's a very, if you don't know it, it's a very useful document, very, very detailed. It sets out lots of guidance on all stages of the Plan, Do, Check Act of auditing, from planning the audit, from planning the audit schedule, running an audit team if the organization is big enough, preparing for the audit, carrying out the audit, the whole bit. It does stress that we need to read the standard flexibly and adapt according to the size and complexity of the organization, as well as the maturity of the management system that we are auditing. And at the back of the standard, there's an annex, which is guidelines to the guidelines. And one of the things it says is this paragraph I've just put up there: we need to exercise professional judgment as to whether the overall intent of clauses have been met, rather than sort of focusing on that very, very detailed forensic examination, word by word, of the clause. And if I apply again my selective highlighter, this is one of the points I love to quote when I'm doing internal auditor courses. Some of the clauses in some of these standards actually don't lend themselves to, if you like, one-to-one relationships with pieces of evidence, going through bullet point 3, show me some evidence, bullet point 4, show me some evidence, bullet point 5. This is ISO, the people who issue these standards, saying actually you can't always audit on a direct one-to-one evidence-based approach like that. You need to exercise judgment and think about the overall intent, the overall why of the clause, not so much the what and how. And similarly, there's a group called the Auditing Practices Group, which again, some of you may know. It's not an official advisory group as such, but it's a group of people drawn from things like ISO technical committees. And they issue guidance to auditors on auditing generally and on auditing to ISO 9001 and 14001 particularly. Useful guidance, not definitive, but still quite authoritative. And one of their guidance documents is a document on adding value. And they say part the value you can add depends a little bit on the maturity of the management system, but there are things the auditor can do. And some of them are these: focus more on the process and less on the procedural detail, more on the results and less on the records generated by the process, because there may be other ways of assessing how effective and how smooth, how well a process is working. And adopt this holistic approach to evidence gathering rather than concentrating on the precision of the words and the dots and the commas. And I think this is great coming from ISO. It encourages us to open our minds a little bit more to that overall purpose and effectiveness rather than just be too pedantic. And if we want to try and focus on that overall effectiveness on areas where, as auditors, we can make a difference, we can raise ideas for improvement that will actually address problems and risks that the organization may be facing. One really good way of doing it, I would suggest, is really very simple. It's so simple that you will have heard it 100 times before in other forums and expressed in 100 different ways. And that is very simply, when we're talking to people, let them talk. Let the auditees take you where they want to go. I mean this not so much in the sort of general sense of interview technique, you know, asking open-ended questions and listening more than we are talking, and whatever advice we may have about body language and so on. But very specifically in the audit context, auditees will very often, if they've got the right relationship with the auditor, if they're comfortable talking to us as internal auditors, as hopefully as colleagues, as one of the team, people will very readily raise issues and audit trails that we as auditors might not have thought of, or we might not necessarily have intended to go there. People will, I've found, quite readily talk about their job, quite readily talk about their work and things that go well, and examples of things that have happened, and also things that aren't so good. They'll talk about the pain points, the hindrances, the things that trip them up. And these are areas that we can pick up on and potentially look into as part of that. Over and above basic compliance, are there areas where we can suggest ideas where things might go more smoothly, or try and alleviate some of those pain points? So as an example, there was a small organization that I went into a few years ago. We were talking about the goods in process, and it came out in the conversation that one of the major irritations for the lady who was collecting the goods in was every time the bell rang, she had to go to the delivery door, pick up the delivery note, and then walk right the way across the factory to collect the appropriate hard copy purchase order, copy of the purchase order that they'd sent to the supplier, and then go back to the goods in area to marry up the documentation. Why? Simply because years ago, it used to be the works manager who issued the purchase orders and therefore kept the purchase order documentation. When that function had been devolved to somebody else, they hadn't thought to rethink the process. And simply by talking it through, identifying this was an issue for her, it was a very simple step to say, well, why don't we change the process, move that paperwork from one side of the factory to the other? And that must have saved her, 20 minutes, half an hour a day. It's not that the process was broken, it wasn't working very well. Most people want their processes and their work to go well, in my experience. Most people want to do a good job and they want to iron out glitches and issues. And if we can possibly find areas where we can contribute to that, then we're adding value. And as I say, quite often people will lead you into areas purely of their own volition that you may or may not have gone. There was an example where I'd been out on a site visit with a service engineer, and among many things that we talked about on the visit, we'd had a look around his van, and I'd taken a note of some of the equipment that he had in his van, and had gone back to check the calibration records for some of that equipment against the calibration register. So I'm sitting with the technician looking through the calibration spreadsheet, checking off all the numbers correspond and so on, all the dates are right, and he's got calibration certificates held on file in respect of all these pieces of kit, and everything was perfect. And as far as I was concerned, I covered that audit trail. And he said to me, oh, and since we're in this spreadsheet, we've got this other tab here, which is the other depot that we also have, which is also controlled through the same process. So we open up this tab, and every piece of equipment on the sheet was in red. It was out of date, or the record was out of date in calibration terms. Now, that was an area he didn't need to take me into. I might legitimately have asked to go there, or I might not. But he was keen to talk through the process and demonstrate all the areas that were covered by the process. It might have been a wonderful example of how well the process was working in another area. As it turns out, it wasn't. And we thereby uncovered a problem which needed to be addressed, which was also a good thing. But as I say, I didn't need to take him there. He took himself there. Most of the conversations that come up spontaneously in these discussions actually aren't about non-conformances. They're about little areas where value can be added, little changes that can be made, or they're about what would be the risk if we change things. And this, for me, is the most value add part of an internal audit. And it's something that actually sets us apart from the third-party audits by certification bodies such as NQA. Because much as a third-party auditor will want, and audit bodies like NQA very much try to add value and promote improvement in the way they audit management systems, they're not allowed by the rules of the game to offer any form of consultancy as part of the audit process. So there's a standard ISO 17021, which is the governing standard for certification bodies, says quite clearly that certification bodies can't offer consultancy. As internal auditors, we do not have that constraint. We still need to be professional. We still need to be impartial in our audits. We still need to provide objectively verifiable evidence for any findings and conclusions we come to. Of course we do. But there's nothing to stop us going beyond that and getting involved in those conversations around how can we improve things? How can we get over these issues or these obstacles that we are facing? And that's part of the value that we can add as internal auditors. And my clients will know my audit reports are full of observations or suggestions for improvements or notes or whatever we may call them. We call them different things with different clients. Some of that is historical, and I'm not overly precious about the terminology. The main point is they're areas that potentially we could look at and consider to improve the effectiveness of the process or the management system. So things like moving the documentation from one side of the of the factory to the other doesn't actually affect the process. It just makes it work better. I go into organizations that have electronic systems for managing their documentation, but they're still maintaining an old-fashioned document register as a spreadsheet. And that's not necessarily wrong, and it's not necessarily broken. But I do have to ask the question, why? What are we achieving in maintaining that document that we're not achieving already somewhere else? What's the risk if we were to lose that document? One of my favorite examples was a little organization, I say little, 15 people or so, that supply industrial equipment. And one of the services that went along with that was supporting installation at customer sites. So when there was an installation job, there was a gentleman called the project engineer, I think, who used to produce a layout drawing of where the kit was going to go in the customer's site and the various utilities and pipelines that needed to be hooked up to make it work. And he'd produce these hard copy layout drawings and he'd send them across to the general manager, who would stamp and sign and date them and send them back to the project engineer, who could then issue them to the installation team. And I sat down with the general manager one day and I said to him, what are you looking at when you look at these documents, when you sign them off? What sort of issues would cause you to hold them up or send them back? And he looked at me and he said, I have absolutely no idea. He said, I don't know anything about layout drawings. If the project engineer says they're right, they're right. I just sign them because we have a procedure that says I have to sign them, because that's what the standard requires, isn't it? Okay, so cue a discussion on what the standard actually does and doesn't require and why. And long story short, of course, that was a whole stage in the process that we were able to cut out. It added no value. In fact, it added delay and some confusion into the process, and it wasn't necessary in the first place. Now, all of these are examples of processes which, if you like, weren't broken. They were comments that we could raise as areas for improvement, but they were all areas where there was an established process or procedure which in and of itself was compatible with the standard. It conformed to the requirements of the standard. It was implemented to the best of the organization's ability, but it just wasn't adding any value. And so where as an auditor, or part of the audit process, we could add value was in challenging that. Why are we doing this? Could we achieve that same objective in another way without offending conformity or without risking non-conformity as far as the requirements of the standard are concerned? We've talked about audit interviews. Of course, the same principle essentially applies when we're reviewing documentation or we're doing data analysis or the more sort of desk-bound aspects of carrying out audits, of which, again, there's been an awful lot in the last year or two, hasn't there? But there is still a need, I think, for us to actively challenge the purpose and the value of documentation that we're looking at. And it may be a document register, it may be a supplier list, it may be questions in a supplier questionnaire that actually we don't do anything with. We just ask the questions, we get the questionnaire in and we file it. We never do anything with that information. And I do like to try and challenge the rationale and the benefit of things in some of these documents. Similarly, when auditing organizations come up with some of the lovely charts and data tables that demonstrate how they are performing, it's worth just a little bit of a sort of active challenge in terms of what does this information actually tell us and what are we doing with it? And what would be the risk if we tweaked it or changed it or didn't have it or substituted it for something else? There's a conversation I've had in various guises with various different organizations around objectives and monitoring of performance against objectives. And it's great that people demonstrate that they've got documented objectives and they demonstrate that there are figures that they're monitoring that demonstrate performance against those objectives. But when I come across a conversation that will say, let's say for the sake of argument, an organization has a quality objective in terms of customer satisfaction, and that's calculated however it is calculated at, let's say, 80%. And typically in a small organization, it'll be set each year at the management review and reviewed and set for the following year at the management review. So I I'm talking to an organization, and last year's target for customer satisfaction was 80%, and it was 80% this year, and the management review has maintained that target at 80% for next year. And that's okay, that's fine. But when we actually look at the figures, it turns out they've been smashing that target for the last year and the year before, and they're achieving results up in the 90s. And don't get me wrong, it's not for me as an auditor to tell an auditee organization what its targets and objectives have to be. That's not my purpose as an auditor. But I do think I'm entitled to question the value of an objective when an organization is saying to me that the message that they are putting out is effectively they are going to be happy with a 10% deterioration in their customer satisfaction year on year. I'll suggest if that was a sales target or a profit forecast, there'd be questions asked. There would need to be some justification. Or let's say it was a health and safety management system we're auditing. And the health and safety manager proudly produces these documents and he says, that's our accident rate for this year. And next year, we're aiming to have 10% more accidents. I think there would be questions to be asked. So we don't need to do all the calculations again or to tell people what their objectives should be, just perhaps question how much value they're adding and what would be the risk actually if we recalibrated the objective based on some of the historical data that we've got. So we put in our audit report, and sadly in some organizations that's the last that we're going to see or hear of some of those issues until the next audit, perhaps the following year, hopefully not in some cases. But I do think that part of our job as auditors again and as management systems practitioners is to follow up on that check act part of the plan, do, check, act cycle. So the audit report goes in with whatever observations, points for action, discussion points, maybe non-conformances. There is that what happens next, what happened to these findings. And I think very often as internal auditors, if we're not on the trail of those actions, not sure sometimes who else is going to be to the same extent. So I think we do have a particular opportunity. And again, because we are internal, because we know the people, we know the processes, we know how things work in the culture of the organization, we do have that opportunity to follow up in the most effective way, perhaps more than auditors in larger organizations or than external third-party auditors who are less frequently in the organization. There's a lot we can say about this, and we don't have time in today's webinar to go into it in detail. I've highlighted here a couple of particular things I think that I would like us to look out for as internal auditors. So the idea that if action is promised, somebody needs to make sure it actually happens. You know, if the non-conformance report says on the bottom of it, we will change the procedure, or we will update the risk assessments, or we'll change the process, so we'll do things in a different way. Who's going to follow up and make sure that actually happens? Who is the person who's going to look at not just correction, but corrective action to look at potential underlying causes and try and make sure that the same things don't happen again? It's great that we've fixed the leak in the roof, but actually, have we done a full survey of the rest of the roof? So we might identify other areas of corrosion where leaks are going to happen next week or the week after if we don't do it. Because if we try and ensure that is done, then we can add value to the organization and save in the longer term on effort and resource and cost and time. And we all know this as management systems thinkers, we know this, but we have an opportunity to try and introduce that thinking or enforce that thinking into organizations that we work with. And that verification of effectiveness bit. Yes, we've done some actions, but have they addressed the initial problem, or is it just action for the sake of it? And all of this applies equally to any of those observations and comments and suggestions for improvement, not just non-compliances or non-conformances. Those are mandated, the corrective action is mandated in the standards if there is a non-conformance. But why not follow up these suggestions for improvement in a similar way. Many of my clients will have something like an issues log or an improvements log or something where we'll log these issues and we'll have a follow-up so we can monitor the status and see where they went and see if anything happened as a result. And actually, half of them don't go anywhere, and that's absolutely fine. But if we're going to kill an action or discontinue it, we've got a record as to why, so we don't go back and have that same conversation again next time round. And of course, if it does go somewhere and we do make some positive changes and there are improvements in performance, then it also gives us an opportunity to go back, revisit that issue and congratulate people. Give them a pat on the back, acknowledge where improvement has been made, because we all like positive strokes. And audit reports shouldn't just be a series of a listing of failures. They're a great opportunity to congratulate and acknowledge good performance and improvements as well. So, in summary, just a few key points. We've talked about the differences between internal and third-party certification body audits. The principal rationale I would suggest for certification bodies is to certify to the outside world that such and such an organization has a management system that conforms to XYZ standard. That's what it says on the certificate. That's what they're there to do and to certify, to verify. As internal auditors, yes, we need to do that, but I think we need to do more as well. And we've got that responsibility as well as opportunity to go beyond that, to look at effectiveness, to challenge the why, to add value in that way. I've talked about why I think we have greater scope and flexibility and greater access to people and processes and documentation in smaller organizations. And we do have this responsibility, as I say, to add greater value. I think that basic ISO function of verifying conformity to requirements is no longer sufficient for internal auditors. I think it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And the thing that clients value and pick out in their testimonials are the things that go beyond that, not simply a tick box that says, yeah, we conform. And elements in doing that we've talked about, thinking about why rather than just what and how, thinking about risk. Where can we deprioritize areas because they're lower risk? Where is there an opportunity to go somewhere we've not been before and add value in a different place? Let people talk. People will identify their own pain points. People will write their own audit reports pretty much if you just let them. And let's use lots of these observations and suggestions for improvement. They are far more potent and valuable and useful, I think, within the internal audit process than the simple black and white of non-conformance findings. They need to be there as well if something clearly is wrong, but I think the more nuanced observations are far more useful in most audits that I'm doing. And that piece about follow through. Let's not just let some of these drop. Let's make sure there is a proper follow through. And that's essentially me and the points I wanted to cover. But I did promise Natalie when we talked about this audit that I would share one of the lessons that I felt I'd learned as a young auditor. And this takes me back to round about 2000, year 2000, and I was fortunate to be taken out by a UCAS accredited certification body on a series of audits, unpaid of course, but in order to gain my audit experience to get my Nqa card. And I remember going to a small organization in the Midlands somewhere, and I think they installed something like aluminium roofing profiles, something like this, two-man company. So on the day of the audit, the fitter was out fitting profiles at the customer site, and I was sat in the office with the MD and owner of the business and his quality consultant who had put the quality system in and was clearly running it very effectively. And as I say, myself and my supervising auditor. And it was a an extremely well-structured, well-documented, absolutely to the letter, perfectly good quality management system. I think it was probably to the 1994 standard at the time, those of you who remember that. So very punctiliously documented, and we go all the way through the day without a hitch until we get to the internal audit program. And the consultant has laid out all the clauses of the standard and how and when he is auditing internally against each of these clauses, except for management review. There is no internal audit of the management review. There's nothing wrong with the management review. We'd looked at it, but there hadn't been an internal audit. So when I raised this, the consultant started huffing and puffing a little bit, and I have to say 20 odd years later, I absolutely understand every huff and puff, and I would do exactly the same in his shoes today. But we had the discussion, and after a while the consultant said, well, look, if it's that important, I can get somebody to do a surveillance visit. And I said, okay, that's fine, but for now I'm going to need to raise that as a minor nonconformity because the standard requires that we carry out internal audits across the entire management system, and we haven't done one for management reviews. Well, you can imagine that didn't go down awfully well. And after a bit of further discussion, a break was engineered in the conversation. I don't remember how, but there was an opportunity for my supervising auditor quietly to take me on one side. And he said to me, Stephen, technically, you're right. He said, technically, there should be an audit of every part of the management system, including management review. So if you were to stick to the letter of the standard, you would be entitled to raise a minor nonconformity. He said, however, you've seen the general standard of the QMS. The consultant has taken your point on board. He's undertaken to do something about it. He said, you may want to think about what additional advantage would be gained by raising that as a minor nonconformity. What additional benefit would there be? And that's all he said. Now, I leave it to you individually to think where you would have taken the conversation from there. I have to say it's a moment I think of very often when I'm out auditing and when I come across an issue. And for me, that's one of the best lessons I ever learned in all those years of auditor training. Thank you, Mike, if you're watching. And that really is me. The slides, when they come out, will have references to further information, some of the things that I've referred to. But for now, and they'll also have my contact details if you want to pick up on anything outside of the webinar environment. But for now, can I thank you for your time? Thank you for bearing with me through my musings over internal audits, and I will have a look in the Q&A panel to see if there are any questions that have come in. Thank you again. Let's see, questions. Okay, so far we don't have any questions, I think. Oh, question. Oh, actually we do have some questions, but I can't see them terribly well. Is there a way I can expand this panel?
Hi, Stephen. Yep, if you just
Hello.
use the next to the questions tab, to the right of the questions tab, you've got the box with the arrow that points to the top left.
Ah, right. Sorry. Okay, right. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen. Right. Okay, so thank you for that. So question, would we get a copy of recording of the webinar? Yes, we will. I think that'll be available through NQA following the webinar. Somebody here saying he likes the approach of asking an organisation why they have the controls in place. Thank you for that. Would you visit the lower risk department at some point? Yes, absolutely. But it's simply a case of deprioritising that and determining the level of risk and how often it's appropriate to visit. Yes, there's a comment here, not auditing everything makes sense, but the new standards say we need to audit every clause. I would say, I haven't been grilled by a third-party auditor on any areas I have missed out. If I had to justify that approach, then I would fall back on that risk-based thinking and say, well, we're managing the risk, and one has to allocate resources according to the risk. Maybe that idea of stretching the audit program over a longer period, the same way certifications do, might help. You know, maybe if one were to say, well, look, this is such a low risk area. If we plan our audits over 3 years instead of over 1 year, and we make sure we cover each area every 3 years, maybe that's an idea. What advice do we have when people try to get out of a situation or work method in an audit against a clause? They say it's down to interpretation. What advice when people try to get out of a situation or work method in an audit against a clause? They say it's down to interpretation. I'm not quite sure I understand the question about things being down to interpretation. There are some things that are down to interpretation. I have on occasion challenged an audit body's interpretation of a particular clause. One does this with some hesitation, but ultimately it is worth, as an auditee, if you feel that an auditor's interpretation of a clause is genuinely not justified by the wording in a clause, then it is worth having that conversation, and if necessary, contesting an interpretation that an auditor has come to. At the end of the day, a requirement is a requirement, but I think one is entitled to interpret the requirements in a way that is appropriate to the individual organization. And again, this is what ISO asks us to do. If we look at the ISO standards, you know, all of them say, for example, in things like the requirements for documentation, you know, they all say the extent of the documentation needs to adapt to the size and complexity and nature of the organization. None of these are 100% templates simply to be dropped into any organization verbatim. Yes, thank you. There's some comments here on supporting my view that working in smaller organizations is easier than larger organizations. Somebody asking here, can you ask questions like, are there any areas of your job that you think could be done differently or better? Great question. And yes, absolutely. I often ask in an internal audit. I will invite people to flag up things that they think could be improved, because they will know the processes better than I will. For all I might be internal, I'd like to consider myself as part of the team. I'm not in that job day in, day out. And somebody who is going to have a much better knowledge of things that could be improved, that we can perhaps take back to the originating department if that's the case, or documents that we can challenge or query, or things that take up time that don't seem to be adding value. Absolutely, yeah. And recruit the auditees in that effort to improve things for themselves. There's a question here. How do we audit clause 4.4.1? So this is the sort of general requirement about having a management system and all the things that the management system needs to do. It's a good question. Two answers to that, if I may. One is, I think this is one of those clauses where I would apply that quote out of ISO 19011 that I used, that it's less appropriate to look for a one-to-one bullet point approach against each clause. It's more appropriate, and it's certainly my preferred modus operandi would be to look more holistically for audit evidence across the patch, perhaps throughout an entire audit, as to evidence of bits and pieces of clause 4.1 being implemented, rather than expect to sit down with somebody and go through each bullet point and identify individual pieces of evidence. But the way I do use clause 4.1 is sometimes there are areas of performance where there appear to be gaps or shortcomings or areas for improvement that don't fall neatly into any other clause, but may actually be supported by one of the requirements in 4.4.1. And so that may be an example of where I might use that clause as a more general support, as opposed to specifically looking to order very tightly against each bullet point. I hope that helps. Okay, there's a request here that I'm sure Natalie will pick up from one of our attendees on accessing training material, free training material through NQA. So I'm sure Natalie, you'll pick that up. Okay, there's a great question here. I've recently started a small micro business. You may consider I am new to the external annual audit review. How would you recommend I prepare for this? The external annual review. My recommendation to any organization in terms of preparing for the external audit is actually that you don't prepare for it. And that might sound very odd, but the day of the audit, as far as possible, should be a day like any other. Your processes should be exactly the same processes as you're carrying out any other day of the year. You don't want to be doing anything extra, anything special for the auditor. What the auditor wants to see is business as usual. They want to see, how do things genuinely run? There's not a lot of value either for the auditor or for yourself, frankly, as a business, putting on a show for the auditor. Because that's extra effort for you. It's putting on a false front, if you like. And actually, if there are areas that aren't quite right, that don't quite fit, it's beneficial in the longer term to have them raised, bring them out into the open, then you can fix them. Then you're not running scared of them each time. So essentially, my advice is don't run around sweeping the floor, especially because the auditor is coming in. And if there are things that you feel uncomfortable with, that you think, actually, I'm not sure this is going to be up to scratch, but I'd better do them because I'm going to get audited to them. I have a principle which I've always worked to, which is that if, as an organization, anybody feels that they are doing something which has no value to it, but they're only doing it because the standard requires it or because an auditor has said they should do it, then probably we're either not doing it right or we're not understanding the underlying purpose of the requirement. We're not understanding that why. Everything that's in the standards is there for a purpose, for a reason. And if the way we're doing it doesn't seem to justify itself to add any value, then I've always tried to go back to that why and think, why would the standard want me to do this? What am I trying to achieve here? And maybe there's a different way of doing it to the way that I've been trying to do it all of this time. And that way may be drop the jargon. You know, a lot of people try and adopt the terminology of the standard because they think that's what auditors want to see. Actually, as an auditor, I'd far rather go into a small organization that has a procedure that's entitled what happens when we plow things up, you know, as opposed to a procedure that's headed non-conformity procedure with lots of words that the organization doesn't understand. So sorry, going back to the question, don't prepare. So far as you can manage to do that, don't prepare. Simply show business as usual. Where are we going? Thank you everyone for your comments. Management review. Plan. Could the aforementioned management review reflect the same thing as auditing a business plan? Again, brilliant question. I would actually say I prefer to see a management review that reflects a business plan rather than something that is put together purely as an agenda to meet the requirements of the standard. And the reason why I say that, and I have a number of clients where at least part of the agenda just doesn't match the agenda in the standard at all. It meets all the same points, but it takes a native document or a native plan, like a business plan or like a SWOT analysis or a risk register or whatever the organization already has, and reviews that. And that's because it's owned by the organization. It's sort of made here as opposed to made somewhere else. But it is also addressing all the requirements that management review requires you to address. It's just doing it in your own native language. So absolutely, if a review of the business plan is helpful and supports some of the elements that are required in the management review, yes, please do that, would be my view. Is the maximum periodicity of internal auditing the same 3-year surveillance period for external audits? There is no stated maximum periodicity or maximum interval to any of these audits. Again, I would say it's a matter of assessing the risk, but being able, the thing is being able to justify to yourself internally and if necessary to the external auditor why you're adopting a particular plan. If it's simply a case of, oh, I think we'll do this every 2 years, it's a bit more difficult to justify. But if you've got some kind of worked out rationale that says, actually, we've thought about all of these areas, and this is why we are doing what we are doing. In my experience, external auditors will be perfectly happy with that, because what they want to see is a planned and controlled approach to maintaining the management system. As long as you can justify that, I think most auditors are going to be happy with it.
Hi, Stephen.
Oh, this is
probably have time for about one more question, and then I think we can answer the rest.
Just trying to scroll through. There was a big question. I'm afraid I've just scrolled past because it's probably a subject for many more webinars about how do you convince senior management of the value of ISO certification above and beyond simply passing the audit. Okay, there was a question here around AS9100. Now, AS 9100, and this is around requiring internal audit of the QMS every year and more detailed analysis of customer performance. AS 9100, because it's aerospace, is more stringent and does have more stringent requirements than the more generic standards that I've been talking to, like 9001 and 14001 and so on. So please, if you are working to some of the more specific and more technical sector standards like AS 9100 or 13485 and some of the others, please do refer back to what the requirements are in the standards, because they will go beyond the general requirements that I've been talking about and those that are in the high-level structure issued by ISO. So sorry, that is a qualification I should have included. Okay, right. Somebody here saying they were advised by their then QA manager not to include observations or suggestions within the internal audits. He's now left the company and it may be beneficial to go back to them. I've had some clients ask me not to put observations and suggestions and improvement in an audit report. And their rationale for that was that in their particular sector, where they might be required to disclose the contents of audit reports to other parties, including possibly to customers, that the interpretation in that sector of an observation or a suggestion for improvement would be something that verges on a non-conformance. And what this particular client felt was that something in his world, what he wanted to see reflected in the audit report was either it's wrong, so it's a non-conformance, or it's okay, in which case don't raise it as a suggestion for improvement because that might raise the wrong ideas, but we can discuss it offline, if you will. In that particular sector, I have to respect the client's interpretation of that. My view, and I did have some discussions with his quality manager at the time, my view was that it was missing out on an opportunity within the audit to add further value, but at the same time, if he felt it would be a detriment for other reasons, then clearly I had to go with his view on that. So I think it's a question of working out with the quality manager or with the relevant management whether the benefits outweigh the risks and disadvantages, to be honest. I think, Natalie, that's the last of the questions. I've probably missed out a few as we've gone through, but if anybody does want to particularly follow those up, either with NQA or with me, as I say, you'll have my contact details on the slides when they are made available by NQA. And bearing in mind we're overrunning now by nearly 15 minutes, perhaps it's time for me to hand back to you, Natalie, is it, to round off?
Perfect. Thank you very much, everybody. Take care.